Welcome to your 10-day trend from the Met Office, 10 days that takes us to the end of November. November so far has seen a repeating weather cycle, which means it's been very wet for some and pretty dry for others. We're only going to see a slow change to that over the next 5 days. Gradually, very gradually, it should be turning a little bit milder as we go into the second half of the weekend. After what's been quite a dry week, it will also be turning wetter, particularly across parts of the south and the west. Let's take a look at the bigger picture. High pressure is kind of influencing our weather, even though it's a few thousand miles away across Siberia. These lows are edging in, and I do mean edging in, and as they're combining, they're squeezing the isobars together, which is why we've got a cold southeasterly wind blowing for the next couple of days. But these weather fronts are only making painfully slow progress, hardly edging in at all by Thursday. What we need is a bit of a kick, a bit of oomph, and this low pressure will provide that. It's being driven by the jet stream, and it looks like taking a spell of very windy weather into parts of Spain, Portugal and France, along with some heavy rain. There is a bit of uncertainty about the exact track of that low, and it does have the potential to bring some heavy rain across parts of the south, especially so on Saturday. As it edges in, though, things get mixed up, and notice the isobars aren't as close together. So those cold winds will slowly be easing as we go into the weekends. But there is the potential for that rain, especially across the south, that could be quite heavy. Compared to the start of the week, it won't be as frosty, but with lighter winds, there will still be some pockets of frost at this time of year where we have clear skies. Now, let's take a look at the bigger picture, but high up in the atmosphere, and take a view of the jet stream. Quite a lively-looking jet stream driving down to the southwest of the UK. That's what's taking that low pressure into France and Spain. And this is the kind of pattern that we've seen quite frequently through November, allowing low pressure systems to affect especially southern parts of the UK. That's how we go into the weekend, but we will perhaps see a subtle change by the time we get to the second half of the weekend. By Sunday, the jet stream isn't amplified. It's not going way to the north and driving to the south. It's more coming straight across the Atlantic. Now, this we call a zonal weather pattern. And this is perhaps a more typical weather pattern, especially so in autumn. And that tends to, instead of looking at low pressures down to the south, it tends to pick up low pressures out in the Atlantic and move them across the UK. So they're not as slow moving. They're bringing spells of wet weather back across the UK, tightly packed isobars, so yes, at times it will be windy, but with the low bringing in milder air from the Atlantic. So instead of those slow-moving weather systems, the weather gets a bit of a supercharge from the jet stream, and we'll see the weather patterns changing a bit more rapidly, at least for a time into the early part of next week. But it's still low pressure, so there'll still be bands of wet and windy weather swinging through, but it perhaps won't be as cold. Now, I talked about those weather patterns shifting, but it's not a dramatic shift. Notice, particularly close to the UK, the jet stream isn't especially lively, and signs are through next week that you could almost see that jet stream trying to bend back and become more amplified again. So that's the big question mark next week. Will the jet stream remain more zonal, or will we see a return to that more amplified pattern and things becoming slow moving again? So yes, a change into the early part of next week, but then uncertainty beyond that. Let's have a look at some charts for later next week. This is the American model showing a chart for Wednesday night of low pressure sitting pretty much slap bang across the UK, rather like Monday's chart. That would again bring mild weather in from the Atlantic and a spell of wet and windy weather as well. But for the same time, the European model has low pressure close to the UK, but it's further east. The jet stream isn't as noticeable. We're on the cold side of the jet, and there's some very cold air not far from the UK. And you can see that if this model's right, that cold air could start to slip southwards right at the end of next week, bringing a significant chill. Now, the uncertainty is shown in this graph here. This is a meteogram showing temperature trends. This one's for Exeter. There's the date along the bottom. The red blobs are the likely maximum temperature. The larger the blob, the greater the uncertainty. So at the start of the period, we're pretty certain that the red blobs will be sitting underneath the average temperature line. So yes, it's going to be cold for the next few days. But there's a trend there. It does get warmer, gets milder through the weekend. And then into next week, well, there's not a great trend there. The blobs are sitting pretty much on that average line, but notice they're getting larger. There's quite a big spread, especially by the time we get to the end of next week. And that's the uncertainty. Will it be turning colder, or will it be milder? We are pretty confident that the main themes are low pressure will dominate next week, so expect further spells of wet and windy weather. But the big uncertainty, the big thing we'll be keeping an eye on as we go towards December is, will it be a mild, wet and windy, or will it be turning a little bit colder? So that's what we'll be keeping an eye on as we go into next week. For you to keep an eye on the day-to-day weather, well, the best thing to do is to subscribe to our YouTube channels or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.